All right, well, we might get underway. I suspect we're it, so let's get started. What we've been doing, just for the sake of Kevin and Di, who have just sort of parachuted in on this final session, the Dean's Forum, we've been doing it on Sundays that are outside of school holidays, or unless I'm away, or it's synod or whatever. So it's kind of been more weeks than not, most of the months of the year. Next year we're probably only going to do it on the first Sunday of the month, which will give me a bit more flexibility to get out to a couple of the country centres, which Camellia has been covering this year. So this was a kind of confirmation, adult faith formation series that went over 6 weeks. If that was turned on, it would go better. So this is sort of bouncing off our little mission statement, but it was a way of teasing out, exploring some different dimensions of faith and practice. And we did it by focusing on these 6 topics. So we started with, so what's Anglican? What are Anglicans? Then we focused on the significance of Jesus and what it means to be disciples of Jesus. And in a sense, we're kind of looping back to that today. We had a week on the Bible, but we've had other weeks earlier in the year when we've looked at different aspects of the Bible. This is kind of an update of the old Anglican Basics program that I ran a few years ago, many years ago actually, at St Francis. We had a week looking at prayer and spiritual practice. Then we had a couple of weeks break with different things happening. Last week we looked at the 5 marks of mission in terms of, so what's the role of the church, what are we here for, apart from keeping the Anglican franchise going. And we're going to wrap it up this week by looking at intentional discipleship. In many ways, probably in some ways, the most important topic in the series, because it's really saying, so how are we going to choose to live out our faith? That's kind of what the question is at the heart of this. So we're going to start with the concept of discipleship. I've got this graphic up to start with. It's just a graph that comes out of the Bible software, but don't worry about the technology behind it. What it does is you can put in a search for a particular word. You can do it in either English or the original languages. So I'm doing it in the original languages in this search. So down the bottom here, too small for you to read, there's a Greek word, mathetes, which is the word for disciple. So when you do a search for the Greek word disciple in the New Testament, this is the distribution chart. That's the number of occurrences per 1,000 words in the Greek New Testament. Okay. Don't worry about the detail behind that. The headline significance is blazingly obvious. The word disciple only occurs in this bit of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts, and it doesn't occur a single time in the rest of the New Testament. Now, when I actually ran that search when I was preparing a sermon a few weeks ago, and I must admit I was surprised that Paul never talks about being a disciple. Like, isn't that Paul's business? Talk about being disciples? Nope, it's not a concept he ever uses. Wow. Nor does it occur in Hebrew or James or 1st, 2nd Peter or 1st, 2nd, 3rd John or the book of Revelation. Never. In other words, this concept of being a disciple only crops up in the 4 gospel books and the book of Acts, but the 4 gospel books that are specifically talking about Jesus. Then the word or the concept of disciple comes up. The book of Acts is kind of really attached to this because, first of all, the book of Acts is, of course, volume 2 of the Gospel of Luke, written by the same person, presumably. So it's really just volume 1, volume 2 of the same story. And, of course, it is continuing to talk about what the disciples of Jesus were doing after Easter. So it's not surprising that there are a few places where the book of Acts references disciple, although it's not as common as what we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. So this idea of discipleship takes us takes us really into it's something which is distinctively, characteristically to do with Jesus himself. When the early church is thinking about Jesus, they talk about discipleship. When they're telling stories about him, remembering what he was doing, they talk about him having disciples. And even the disciples, of course, after Easter, get rebadged as apostles. An apostle is like, so a disciple is like a learner, has an L plate on. An apostle is somebody that doesn't even have their green peas. They're now in charge. So a significant change to go from being a disciple to being an apostle. And Paul is very keen on the apostle word. If I ran a similar search, as I just showed you, you'd had almost the reverse. Apostle hardly ever occurs in the Gospels, but it occurs a lot in Paul's letters. Not surprised, because that was one of the arguments, whether Paul had the authority of an apostle. So when we talk about being an apostolic church and being in the apostolic succession, that's church language for saying we're kosher, we've got permission to do stuff, we're sort of accredited, we have the credentials. That's what apostleship is about. Discipleship is a whole other bit of the food chain. Discipleship is about learning. Somebody and being in a relationship with somebody from whom you're learning. So if we're talking about intentional discipleship, discipleship is very much about our relationship with Jesus. So it suggests we're a follower. To be a disciple of somebody is to be a follower, to be a learner, to be a student. And certainly in the ancient world, teachers who had groups of students or disciples, often if they didn't live 24/7 with the teacher, they would at least spend a significant amount of the day, every day, with the teacher. It wasn't just, well, I'll do a class on prayer at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, be there. And if you're late, you can watch the video. I'll put it online later. If you're a disciple of John the Baptist, disciple of Gamaliel, disciple of Jesus, you hung out with them. You spent time with them. It's sort of like almost like a master and a tradesman's teaching an apprentice. You were there with the person, watching, learning attitudes as much as skills, picking up the vibe. So it's about being a follower, it's about being a learner, about being a student, and the other half of that equation is there's somebody who we're looking up to, who's our model, who's our rabbi, our master, our teacher. And there's these days in professional standards language, we talk about the power differential between a master and a student, between a rabbi and a disciple. That they're not just, they obviously share a lot of interests, but they're not just mates hanging out doing stuff they enjoy together. There's a qualitative difference in the status of the follower and the teacher. Remember in John's Gospel, at the Last Supper scene, Jesus goes around and washes their feet, and then he says in that story, you call me master, and rightly so, but this is the kind of leadership I want to see amongst you guys. It's what we would now call servant leadership. The other thing about disciple, of course, is that it's linked with the word discipline, not as in whack whack. So when I was a kid at school, discipline meant hold out your hand for 6 cuts or whatever. That was discipline. Okay, but discipline is really when we embrace certain obligations, certain constraints, and we channel our efforts and our energy within those restrictions. So discipline in terms of discipleship is choosing to put some limits as to what we're going to be doing, and not simply flopping around and seeing what happens to pop up as we go along. It's a much more disciplined, thought out kind of process. So, for example, interestingly, the early Christian traditions, including the book of Acts, which was up there before, describe Jesus as having been a disciple of John the Baptist. Now, they only tell us of really one or two incidents between Jesus and John in the Gospels. But that wasn't enough. Just turning up once to hear John speak wouldn't make Jesus a disciple. Okay? Just going once to the river and asking John to baptize him wouldn't make him a disciple. Discipleship is not like getting your name on the parish roll. Okay? If Jesus really was a disciple of John, then presumably he spent a significant amount of time with John down in that semi-desert region just north of the Dead Sea, where the traditional baptism site is. And we know there were other people who were disciples of John, and some of those transferred their enrollment, as it were, and they switched from being disciples of John to being disciples of Jesus. Some of them did that before John died, while he was still active. We never get told how John felt about that, by the way. Like, I've been working with these guys for 18 months, and now they've gone off with that Jesus guy instead of sticking with me. I mean, what was the dynamic of shifting from being a disciple of Jesus to being a disciple of John? So, and of course, the early Christians were a little bit embarrassed about the fact that Jesus had been a disciple of John, because that implies master-student, more status, less status. John's the more significant character. Jesus is the guy with the L plates on the back of his sort of prophet robe. Okay? So that, as a historian, of course, that actually works the other way, because the fact that the early Christians described Jesus, their leader, their master. Okay, I thought you weren't going to make it today because I thought you'd be busy with the washing up, but welcome. Just finished. Okay. We're talking about discipleship, and we're just talking about John and Jesus, John the Baptist and Jesus. So for the early Christians, there were two really kind of awkward facts about Jesus they just had to deal with. One was that he was crucified by the Romans. Now that meant he was a serious problem to the Roman authorities. They didn't just crucify anybody because Pontius Pilate had a headache or something. I mean, to be crucified meant they'd seriously decided you had to be taken out. You weren't going to be sent to the galleys. You weren't going to be sold into slavery. You were going to be eliminated. The worst possible form of cruel death they could devise. So to be trying to promote Christianity and have a Jesus who's crucified is a bit awkward. But the fact that it's an awkward truth means it's the most definite thing we know about Jesus, that he was crucified. Okay? Because no one would make that up. It's not the kind of story that anyone in the early church is ever going to invent. They might be inclined to make up or exaggerate other stories. No one is going to invent the idea that Jesus was crucified. The second thing that was really awkward was that he started out as a follower of somebody else, namely John the Baptist. And that implies, if he's a disciple of John, it implies that John is more important than Jesus. And Jesus is the learner. So again, no early Christian is going to make that up. We can see them massaging it a bit to try and play down John's role in the New Testament. And they never tell us anything about how long Jesus spent with John, but they never rub out this little detail on his CV that he was a disciple of John the Baptist. And that John, according to John's Gospel, John the Baptist actually pointed Jesus out to some of his own disciples, remember in John chapter 1, and then they followed after him and said, hey, can we have a chat with you? And so on. So the relationship between Jesus and John is unclear, but it's probably was far more substantial than what we get described in the New Testament, simply because there was enough of a connection for even Jesus' followers to remember that Jesus had been a disciple of John the Baptist. Okay? And then, of course, Jesus himself attracts other people to be his disciples. And as far as we know from the stories that have survived, he never accepted volunteers. Everybody who became a disciple, I want you to come and follow me. And the others who said, look, I'd like to be one of your disciples, but first I need to wait for the old fella to die, or I've got some problem. Don't worry about it. We don't need you. Go home and bury your father. Don't bother coming with me. He's a bit of a hard character at times, because discipleship is about discipline. Not just, I think I'll do this for a bit. Give it a bash, see how it goes, like joining the gym for 3 weeks. That didn't work. Okay, whatever. So it's about a longer term kind of commitment. So disciple, and we got into this by talking about this diagram here, which just shows that in the New Testament, we only find the word disciple in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. The rest of the New Testament not once uses the word, which is kind of surprising. Okay. So, I mentioned that disciple also includes the idea of discipline. So, disciple is somebody who's in a learning relationship with a master, with a rabbi, but they also adopt the disciplines of that master. You may remember that one of the stories in the Gospels is that the disciples come to Jesus and say, John the Baptist taught his disciples how to pray. Please teach us how to pray. Like we're going to be really your disciples. You've got to teach us some of your secret God stuff, some of your spiritual package. We want to be part of it. So in the case of John the Baptist, we know a little bit about John. We have 2 sources for John, just as an aside. There are the Gospels that tell us a little bit about John the Baptist, and there's Josephus, the Roman historian, who was probably born round about the time that Jesus and John died. So John is murdered in 28, Jesus is murdered in 30, according to our calendar. Josephus was from a very well-connected Jewish family, and when the Jewish rebellion broke out in 66, so that's 36 years after the death of Jesus, John was the commander of the Jewish forces in the Galilee. Okay, so he's presumably 30-something at the breakout of the war, and he dies round about 95 or 100. So he lived about 60 or so years, which is pretty normal. Not so normal for soldiers. Maybe he wasn't really at the pointy end of the battle formation if he was the commander. So he's somebody who's a younger contemporary of Paul. And he's born after both John the Baptist and Jesus have died. But he refers to John the Baptist, and he describes John the Baptist being executed by Herod Antipas. So we have like a Gospels tradition, and we have Josephus. So we know from our sources that John the Baptist had people who came and spent time with him, that he insisted they be baptized, which was a form of ritual bathing, which Jewish people did not do. Baptism was used when a Gentile was becoming Jewish. So he's saying, in effect, you've got to pretend you're not even Jewish. You've got to kind of start this whole thing all over again. That's what John's baptism was about. He was, according to Luke 7 and the similar passage in Matthew, he was telling the tax collectors they should stop cheating, ripping too much out of people, screwing people for more tax than they needed to, and that he's telling soldiers that they shouldn't abuse their power by getting favours off the local people or else. Okay, so we get a bit of a sketch of John the Baptist, that he had some expectations of his followers, that they'd act with justice, they would be people who took repentance seriously and would express that in baptism, and that they would fast, because that's part of that tradition in the Gospels. John the Baptist's disciples fast on these days. What day do you want us to fast? Because we're your disciples. Okay? John taught his people to pray. Will you teach us how to pray? So we begin to get a sense that the John school of spirituality had certain kind of practices which everybody had to do. So what about Jesus? What about Christianity? What are our spiritual disciplines? Well, because of our roots in the John the Baptist movement, guess what? Baptism is part of our spiritual disciplines. It's not just a naming ceremony for a cute baby. It is that, culturally, but spiritually, it's about identifying with this Jesus who dies and rises and going through this overwhelming experience as if we've kind of drowned and come back to life, which we only do symbolically these days with a few drops of water, unless we completely immerse the person. One of the really important disciplines for Christians is, of course, the Eucharist. And some people like to go to Eucharist every day. That's often seen as a bit over the top. But certainly there's a very early practice. Right from Easter, the followers of Jesus developed this practice of gathering once a week on Saturday night, Sunday morning to celebrate Eucharist. And this was seen as a sacramental, again, participation in Jesus' life and death. And it's how we become his people, because we ask for his life to become part of us. And there's a rhythm to the Eucharist, which we can talk about some other time, which is sort of a pattern for life in itself. Prayer. One of the most loved parts of the Christian tradition is the Lord's Prayer. How do we get the Lord's Prayer? Well, according to the Gospels, the disciples said, teach us how to pray. And he says, well, when you pray, do it like this. He didn't mean this is the prayer you must say 3 times a day, but this is the kind of way you would pray. We had a session on the Lord's Prayer some months ago now. So baptism, Eucharist, prayer are part of the Christian spiritual disciplines. I should probably have included in this list fasting, but I didn't think of it yesterday when I was putting this together. But certainly in the early church and right down to the modern church, there are traditions about fasting. And fasting is about saying, I'm choosing not to pig out. I'm choosing to have some limits in my life. I'm not just going to be a perpetual teenager and eat from one end of the table to the other because I can. Okay? Fasting is about saying, no, I'm going to put limits on what I'm doing, and then what I do choose to do, I will appreciate all the more. And for us, for most people, we pay more attention to that during Lent. Of course, remember, for Catholics, up until a couple of decades ago, Friday was a no-meat day. That's why the fish and chip people were so busy on Friday afternoon, because there was that discipline of not having meat on Fridays. Good Friday particularly, many of us would observe Good Friday as a fasting day. And there are other days in the calendar which can be observed as fasting days. So that idea of, and that really rubs against the grain of our consumer culture, doesn't it? I've got to have more, I've got to have more, I've got to have more. And the church is saying, actually, you can get by with less. You can get by with less. You don't have to shove all that stuff into your mouth. So I should add fasting to this little list, because it's one of those traditions that goes right back to the practice of Jesus. And then, of course, there's Scripture. And as we talked about a few weeks ago now, it's not that Scripture has an answer to every question, but as we immerse ourselves in Scripture, we learn how to ask the questions and where to look for answers, how to figure out the answers. We don't simply go to the Bible to get the answer, but we familiarise ourselves with Scripture so that we're better at working out what the question is and how we might tackle it. And I like to think of, this doesn't work with younger people, but I like to think of the Bible as a set of past exam papers, okay, rather than a book of answers. You can go and practice, you can see how people have answered challenging issues in their lives hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then we've got different questions to deal with today. So add fasting into your mental list. But the other disciplines are, and these start to get a bit uncomfortable for us maybe, proclaiming or witnessing. I was going to put sharing, but I want to use that word a bit later in the list. So one of the things disciples do is they talk about the program they're on and how good it is. Whether it's Pilates or whatever. If we're enjoying it, if we're finding it helpful, if it's adding some value to our life, we talk about it. Unless we're Anglicans, in which case we don't want to talk about God because it's a bit embarrassing. But actually one of the disciplines of being a disciple is that we're willing, when required, when there's an appropriate moment, we're willing to kind of articulate why we are people of faith. Remember last week I used the words from Francis of Assisi, yeah? Preach without ceasing, use words if necessary. You don't have to be shoving words down people's neck, but we do have to be gently, persistently and consistently sharing what we do, witnessing what we believe. Another thing a disciple was told to do, and think back to the 12 and so on, they were sent out to heal the sick and to expel demons. I'm not going to turn you into exorcists, but our way of doing that would be to say, we're on about healing and restoring and making well the whole of life. Where something is broken, we want to be people who fix it rather than people who make it worse. Again, think of that prayer which we attribute to St. Francis. Okay? Where there is fear, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, let me bring light, and so on. Okay? And that's what I mean by we're people who are in the business. We're people in the business of fixing, healing, restoring, increasing the percentage of goodness and reducing the active percentage of badness. Excuse me. And that's what I want to suggest is that's part of the stuff we do. It's part of our discipline. We're expecting this to be happening in ourselves, but we're also trying to facilitate it in others. This is why I couldn't use share at the top of the list. Sharing what we have. If you go back to the time of Jesus, he told people about prayer, he taught people about fasting, and he taught them about alms giving, ALMS, giving alms, charity. We don't like that word anymore. It sounds like a tax dodge, but basically, Christians should be the kind of people who, as part of our spiritual discipline, allocate a percentage of what we have to be given away and used in God's work. Now, in the past, the church has said, oh, we'll have that. Just give it to us and we will put it to good use. Okay? But actually, it's not just about what we give to the church. The real game, of course, is how much are we making available for God's justice and God's compassion, the resources that are at our disposal, which we can give to people in need. That's the question here. Now, if you're if you say a Muslim, that they have the zakah, which is the sort of percentage you're meant to give to charity. Same tradition for Muslims as for Jews and Christians: prayer, fasting, works of charity, almsgiving. These are three ancient spiritual disciplines in the Christian world, and we've in the religious tradition of the Abraham traditions. So, sharing what we know, being involved in making things right, which can include social justice and so on, and actually choosing to live with less disposable income because we're choosing to make some percentage of our income available for people who need it. Whether that's done through the church, whether it's done by sponsoring a child through World Vision, whatever it happens to be. This is an important spiritual discipline for people of faith. You're all sitting there very quietly. Is this surprising you or challenging you, or just saying, yeah, that's what we all think that way. We all give blah, blah, blah. How's that sitting with you?
Bringing up memories.
Memories? The church used to be like this.
Memories of the journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
How can we, bringing up memories, as Greg speaks, just memories of liking back to the journey.
Okay. And we haven't done as good a job in the last few decades of talking about this stuff and inculcating these values in the worshipping community, let alone the baptism family community, because we don't want to put people off. But if coming to church makes no difference, why come to church? Okay, I mean, if it doesn't make any difference, why bother? You might have children or grandchildren that think that way. I do. Or siblings. Okay, and so I guess in a sense, what I was just referring to, those last couple of comments, we've got used to talking about the alt-right, the alternative extreme right wing. And I guess there are alt-left organisations around as well. But part of what Jesus was doing when he was calling people to be disciples, part of what the early church was doing after Easter, was they were creating alternative human communities where people found healing, found forgiveness, found acceptance, found that if they were needing something, other people in their community were there to support them. Of which the old sort of casserole bank is kind of one example of that kind of mutual care for each other. So we don't want to play this so hard that there's no connection between the life of the church and the life of the rest of the society. But there should be something different. There should be some distinctive value. And part of it is that we matter to each other. And although we're mostly not relatives, family, kin, in that sense, we become as close as kin. And that can then mean, of course, there's potential for abuse and other things. But there has to be, part of being a Christian is that we're building communities that empower us to be the kind of people God wants us to be. Before I flick off that screen, any other observations or comments? So add fasting in here somewhere. Alms giving, of course, is over here. Any other observations about that?
It's a bit like over time, and particularly in the modern world, we've given parts of it away to the collective, of which one example would be the welfare state.
Yeah.
And that gives us the excuse personally to sort of take a step back because we're paying our taxes and these other people are doing that. However imperfectly. So it gives us an excuse not to engage.
Yes, there is a genuine argument to say, well, in some ways, the modern national state that taxes people and uses some of the tax to run hospitals and health systems and NDIS programs or whatever, that's partly the Christian culture flowering in the world. And in a sense, the church no longer needs to, once upon a time, only the church ran hospitals. Only the church ran schools. Okay, now that value, people saw the value of that, and it's become a community responsibility. So then people argue, well, why do we need church schools, or why do we still need church-run aged care facilities, or whatever? Well, hopefully, if done well, the presence of church in an institution might still be a bit of leaven in the lump, might make a difference. A school, one would hope that an Anglican school, for example, or a Catholic school, is not simply a place where slightly better off people are choosing to aggregate their kids so they're not having to mix with the rough kids, but it's actually a place where there's a focus on compassion and care and so on. It's a moot point as to whether that's a reality, because many state schools still can be like that. From what I hear, the current principal at South Grafton High is really doing well in that kind of department, as it were. So some of our charitable contributions are taken from us by the government. We have no choice. Then the question remains, so okay, in our kind of culture, how do we still do this? How do we still practice this? Because if we just say, the government's looking after that, we're losing something, I think.
And it's, when I first went into the bookshop, there was one of these supplies had a very small little thing, and I don't remember it all, but it was all about distilling goodness into the world in relation to, say, the retail industry. And it was saying that goodness isn't out in the world, then we really have no good, we don't have anything.
Yeah.
So it's the consistency of the churches through the schools, through whatever means they do, and we're out there. We're all out there distilling that goodness into the world. And
Sure.
that has to...
So consistency and presence, but it's also the Christian teacher in the government school. It's not just the teacher in the church school. I mean, so this is the challenge. How are we going to be people who are working for healing and justice and opportunity for disadvantaged kids, whether we're in a church school or a government school, and whether we're in NDIS or whether we're working in some other sector. So what I'm saying is the temptation to say the government's looking after it, that's probably not a safe long-term strategy, any more than to say, well, the church is looking after it, they're running the orphanages, every kid will always be safe in a church orphanage. Hey. No, exactly. So, but the things that we might have done, like if you're in a culture where there are no government-funded health services or no aged care services, then we're more likely to do that amongst our own group. So we've still got to keep that edge to our discipline. We can't just say, the government's doing that now, it's all cool. We can just focus on singing nicely in church or something. Okay, that's never going to be enough. Yeah.
How do you see Grafton at the moment with all this?
You mean the city of Grafton or the parish of Grafton?
The city of
Well, the things that are on this side that aren't really part of the city life at all. And one of the dynamics is that if you look at the most recent census, 27% of the people in the Grafton local government area, which is about 10,000 people, 27% of them say they're Anglicans. So even if we just said, well, how are the 27% of people living on this side of the river who say, how are they doing? Not very good.
Maybe some of the church around.
Yeah, well, okay, but they're not doing too good, I suspect, on most of that stuff. And therefore they're probably also not doing so good on this side of the ledger. But then, how well is the parish doing on that stuff?
27% is what, 2,700?
It is. It's always good to have an accountant in the room. Even I'd worked that number out while I was talking. Yes. That's okay. We'd be more than happy to have multiple services of 500 people, back-to-back services every Sunday. It's never been like that.
Get the TV.
So part of it is we've got to have this sense of, remember Jesus talks about the leaven in the lump, the salt. Okay. We know that it's the influence that a small group of people can have for good or bad. This is what fake news is all about, isn't it? Tiny handful of people spreading malicious, false news items, using social media, can spark a fire and set a mindset going which validates racism and xenophobia and so on. And similarly, a similar small group of people who are consistently out there for compassion and generosity and justice could make a positive difference. Maybe that's what this is about. At least if the people that are consciously practicing our faith can say, no, we are here to make a difference. We are a candle in a dark room. The darkness doesn't actually put the candle out. The candle still burns and it illuminates just a little bit. The salt, we don't want the meal to be so salty we can't enjoy it. But some of us still like a little bit of salt just to bring out the flavour. To add the turmeric into whatever. We don't want so much turmeric that you can't eat the stuff or drink the stuff and so on. So it's this being a catalyst for wholeness, catalyst for health. Remember, the word salvation is the same word as salve. It's like the ointment. Okay, we're not trying to make everybody in town religious, but it'd be good if we could somehow be that healing, reconciling, generous spirit that the civic community needs if it's going to be healthy. Otherwise, we become nasty, snarling, kind of unhappy community.
So somehow, in order to do the stuff on the right hand side, we have to recognise that will in some way cost us in some way. And if it's not costing us in some way, we're probably not doing it.
Yeah, and that's partly what alms giving is about. If we're not giving, and remember the gospel today was the widow with the 2 coins. Okay, those little coins, they're called a pruta. I've got a few of them. I should have brought them. They're about the size of my wrong finger to hold up. It's about the size of my fingernail. Okay, so a denarius was a day's pay for a worker, silver coin. And there were 968 pruta to a denarius. Okay, it's like $1 and a 1 cent piece. Only it's more than that. It's like $10 or something and a 1 cent piece. I mean, the ratio is almost 1 to 1,000. So 1,000th of a day's pay. And this woman had 2 of those, and she put them in the collection tin at the temple. Okay? And that hurt her, or that impacted on her choices more than the rich people who dropped in a bag of coins, 500 pruta, 20 denarii, whatever, because they had plenty back home. So if we're not, whatever our level is, if we're not using our time and using our energy and using our available financial resources to the point that we notice a difference, then are we actually doing enough? And it can't say, well, it's this many dollars a week. No, it doesn't work. There's not this many minutes a week. But are we choosing to go without? Remember the old 1970s left-wing kind of sticker? Living simply so that others can simply live. It's that kind of thing. Alan, back to my coffee.
Isn't the pitch in this day and age the multimedia implement, whether it's your phone or whatever it is, and this can be seen in riots and people ringing up hundreds and hundreds of people and say, come here, we're going to do this, and 50, 60 or 70% of the calls go to that input. Now, it's the same with the school. The school, whether it's a public school or a church school, teaching a standard of education. But the church school is, with that education, it's giving them a broader picture of a Christian life.
We hope.
And that's
Yes.
the pitch.
Mm.
Now, if you get 20% success in that pitch, then that, if you take it from a child from when he can think reasonably, say 6, 7, 8, say 8 to 16, and you, through the process of the school, he's getting a perfect education, exactly the same as the public school. He's performing quite well in all the tests and everything. But in that period, he has gone through baptism, confirmation, and then a little bit of a plan for living through life. Then we are talking about the community being perhaps 10% Christian, like active Christians, and then you'll start to build the momentum. And this is the way I'm thinking that you are thinking, because you've come here to project that into a bit of a plan for the parish. And I think that's the way we've got to think today.
Yeah, no, thank you. Interesting observations. We know it seemed to be a big deal a few years ago. Maybe it still is, but my kids are no longer that age. Remember when the fear was, don't mention there's a party at your place on Facebook, or else there'll be hundreds of people turn up, most of whom you don't know, and they'll trash the place and so on. I don't know whether that's still an issue, whether we've just learned to be more discreet in how we advertise, but that's the power of social media. And again, I guess, of course, I would love to see more people sitting in church on Sunday morning. What I'd love to see even more is more people practicing their Christian faith wherever they are during the week. Now, they're not disconnected, but if I've got a choice, if we can use social media, the point of this daily thought for the day on the phone thing is to give people a little sort of micro sermon each day, a little bit of spiritual wisdom, and it goes out to them. When we live stream the sermon, we'll have 200 people watch the sermon. Don't normally have 200 people in the cathedral, and so on. So it's that. And again, think back to the parables of Jesus. You sow a seed, you wait for the response, but we've got to be actively developing this kind of a culture, where it's not just about have the kid done. If you're lucky, they'll get confirmed. It actually is about developing a community of practice, community of faith, which is we're going to come to in a second. So to keep it moving along, because it's almost 22, it is 22. This gets to the question of intentionality. So we're talking about a faith which is chosen rather than just inherited. Now that's a transition for us as Anglicans, because we've done really well for several hundred years with the assumption that everybody in the village was Anglican, Church of England. Okay? And for the last 200 years, that's been breaking down. It hasn't just broken down in the last 20 years. That's been breaking down, at the very least, since the Industrial Revolution. Okay? Because that's when the traditional village life broke down and people moved to the cities because there was employment, mechanisation, and that process of change, of course, is. So we have to move more. We can no longer assume that because there's a cathedral sitting here, people are going to turn up. They'll wander through during the week and take photographs, but they're not going to turn up on Sunday morning just because it's there. And that's true of the church in Logan or anywhere else. It's got to be more than just, not a case of build it and they will come. That culture, that's gone. Part of what we're doing is, while we're not anti-culture, we are swimming against the tide of certain currents in our culture. And that's not a bad thing. People matter to us. People matter more than things, and so on. So that's and it's not about how many shiny toys can we have. There's more to life than that. And so we are slightly swimming again, and to the extent that our media, I don't just mean television, but our mass media and our entertainment culture is developing and reinforcing the idea, just come and have fun, do this, you'll feel good. Okay? And there's a really interesting paper, actually it's a couple of years ago, but I came across it a couple of weeks ago, and it talks about the sort of demoralisation of the younger generations, because they know the world cannot sustain what we're doing, but they're like us, they're hooked into, I want to get an upgrade to my phone, I want to, okay, and they know it's not working and it's not sustainable, but everybody else is doing it. And the church, in a sense, Christianity, is partly saying, actually, that's not the way to live if you want to be really alive. Now, that's a tough message to try and get out, but it is a message worth getting out. It's about encouraging people to make choices rather than just being persuaded by the advertising and their peers that this is what we're going to do. You know, this is trending is one of the catch cries now. This is what's trending this week. Well, I better get it as well. Not necessarily, okay? This is trending at the moment is the current version of everybody else is doing it. Okay? Everybody else is doing it is not the mantra for Christian discipleship. If we're serious about being Jesus people, Jesus didn't do what everybody else was doing even in the first century. If he was, he would have stayed home in Nazareth, got married and had 12 kids. Okay? Because that's what everybody else was doing, and that's what they believed God wanted them to do. Jesus didn't do what everybody else was doing. So intentionality is about making choices, but also practicing our choices and renewing them from time to time, and of course dealing with the fact that we won't always pull it off. We'll have aspirations and we'll be performing down here. Okay? So what do we do? It's like when you join the gym. You're going to go every day, whatever, and when you find you're not going every day, do you say, I'll cancel my membership? Or do you say, actually, I do want to go every day, so you increase the commitment? Okay, why? Are you looking at Derek like that?
Because I'm meant to go to the gym 3 times a week.
Okay, whatever happens. But I mean, this is setting choices is good, and we know we're not going to live up to them. So when we don't live up to them, do we just drop our standards down, or do we say, actually, no, I might need to be a bit more realistic, but I'm going to make the effort. In other words, not just drifting through life, but actually living through life, making choices. So part of this is of course having a sense of who we are as people of faith and why we're here, what God wants to do. Remember last week we talked about the marks of mission. We talked about, and this is just a quick summary, these 5 terms: telling, sharing the gospel; nurturing people, baptizing, teaching, and so on; serving where something's going wrong, be there for people to make a difference; addressing questions of justice, where things are wrong, do something about it. I mean, that's how, to use a Brisbane example, that's how the Queensland Children's Hospital got founded. Mary McConnell saw there was a need for sick children to be dealt with, so to be looked after. So she started running a little hospice hospital up in Spring Hill or whatever, which eventually grew into the Queensland Children's Hospital and now has relocated across to the Martyr site. But see something wrong, do something about it. It's in our DNA. And looking after the integrity of creation, realizing that, as the Bible tells us, we're put into this world to nurture it, not simply to exploit it. Without the world, there is no us. So that's the sort of global church level marks of mission we talked about last week. Another way of thinking about it, a simpler way of thinking about it, but it's a bit sneaky because it affects everything, is this familiar line from the prophet Micah. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Imagine if we had a reputation around town that the people who go to the cathedral act like that. Okay? It doesn't mean there'd be more people at church on Sunday necessarily, although there probably would be, but it would mean that people would be paying attention. When the cathedral did something or said something, people would be more inclined to pay attention if we had a reputation for being genuine. Okay? And you can't get that by advertising. We only get it by consistent performance over the long haul. And then, of course, there's a guy called Jesus, and we know what he said. Love the Lord your God with your heart and soul and mind and strength. Love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. It all depends on that. Loving God, loving others. So we've got these two summaries. So in broad terms, we all know that's kind of what we're here to do. Collectively, individually, in our families, we're running a business. If we only run the business to make money, unless we've got an absolutely essential product, we're not going to be very successful. And if it's that essential, someone else will start selling it and being nice at the same time. And the customers will go there. Okay? We know that in the end, it's about how we treat people. Not what we believe, it's how we act. So then it comes down to a very old-fashioned idea, which is the idea of a rule of life. This is an ancient spiritual practice, and many, many contemporary people are using it as well. You basically, it can be something you do on the back of a really small bit of paper, and better that than a long detailed thing. It's setting out some key points of accountability for myself. These are the things I'm going to hold myself accountable for. So clarifying and focusing in on what's important. Setting some goals, and typically, it'll go back to the sort of disciplines we talked about earlier. Setting some goals in terms of worship and spiritual formation. Setting some goals in terms of how we use our energy to make a difference. Setting some goals in terms of our family life or our work life or whatever. Not making it too complicated. A beautifully crafted rule of life can be an evasion of living. Okay? It has to be really simple, has to be relevant, has to be personal, has to be realistic. Then, of course, we have to review them from time to time and use them as a kind of feedback loop. So we're setting ourselves some personal goals. This is like the turbo version of a New Year's resolution. Okay, turbocharged New Year's resolution, but it's slightly more realistic. Setting some goals. If we have a spiritual director, discussing with that person, they might say, well, come on, be real, you're never going to do that. So what? Yeah. What are you trying to say here? Now, what's the bite-sized bit you can do? Let's practice that. We could always increase it next year. Okay? And it's all about intentionality. And that's, of course, is our theme for today. Having an intentional practice of discipleship. Not just kind of, we found ourselves Anglicans and it's okay, it doesn't make too many demands on us. will just kind of float through life and have a nice funeral at the cathedral at the end and won't really have made a splash in the world or made a difference in anybody else's life. But we'll be very nice people on the way through. Okay? That's not the game, is it? Being nice people helps, but it's actually about making a God difference in our own lives and in other people's lives. I think that's the end. Oh, almost. Okay. So we've talked about this a little bit already. Where this has to happen, of course, is outside of church. Okay? Remember at the end of the Eucharist, we say, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Get out. Go and do it. Go and put it into practice. And the reason we come to church, or the reason we connect with the church community, whether we do that by our phone or however we do it, is that's where we find our inspiration and our strength and our values being reinforced. So it becomes our community of practice, the community where we learn to pray, the community where we come for the Eucharist, a community where we reflect on Scripture together. But we don't spend the rest of the week in church. We get out. We do stuff in the community. So it's that moving backwards and forwards between the community of faith, the community of practice that helps to shape us, and then getting out and practicing our faith in the world. All right? A couple of minutes spare, but we're doing okay time-wise. Any other observations as we wrap up?
Yeah, have you noticed any kind of tangible antagonism towards the church because of all the negative publicity that's been in the media in recent times?
Yeah, the church has had, the issues have been focused more recently, particularly with the Royal Commission. But even, I mentioned this, not this particular detail, but 20 years ago, I suppose, I was working at Griffith University at Mount Cravat, Nathan, and in the education faculty. I remember one of my staff said, I would never let my kids go to church, they're just a bunch of kid fiddlers. Now, that was 20 years ago, long before the Royal Commission. Okay, yeah, there'd been the odd Catholic priest go to jail, the odd Anglican priest go to jail, but already that attitude was out there. So our own failure to do the right thing and to deal with people who weren't doing the right thing, that has caused us, apart from the damage to the kids, it has meant that a lot of people have no time for us. Families who have, and this is almost every family in the world really, but families who have loved ones who are gay or lesbian just don't understand why we're still agonising over this stuff. Because they've realised that the kid, the grandkid, the cousin, whatever, matters to them. And their sexuality isn't the important thing. All the drama this last week or two with Sydney Diocese, not wanting to have smoking ceremonies in church halls, not wanting to have yoga groups using the church hall because they're pagan, not wanting to have gay, or wanting the power to expel gay students from overpriced Anglican schools in Sydney, wanting to be able to sack gay teachers, but apparently not wanting to do anything about straight teachers that are living together but not getting married. You know, the hypocrisy and the lack of compassion means there's a lot of pushback against the church. And there's just a lot of, but that's part of it, but I think the other part of it is simply that people's lives are now so busy, or people are feeling so pressured for time. By the time they get to the weekend, they're either gone away to spend family time camping or whatever, or they're just kind of chilling out, trying to get a little bit of family time. So us continuing to do church on Sunday morning may not be the answer. I mean, Austinville Parish has actually completely turned its worship cycle inside out, and they have different services on different days of the week for different age groups. So the traditional Sunday morning thing is really done on Thursday morning for people that want that kind of service. and there's an after work service, and there's a, so, and that's just too hard. We have to change so much. Okay, yeah, or we can just shut down. Choice is ours. Ultimately, yeah. So there is some antipathy, and the culture is becoming more secular, and it's also suspicious of privilege. And we still have privilege. We don't pay rates, we don't pay taxes on our income and so on. So we have privileges which we're exercising in ways which are increasingly out of sync with the values of our society.